Good afternoon. I'm Josie Foss, the Executive Director of the Robert Schalkenbach Foundation. Thank you for joining us for the second event of the Progressive Ideas webinar series. All of the presentations in this series feature work done with the support of grant funding from the Foundation into topics related to our mission. Today, we're welcoming Dr. Enrico Rubolino. Enrico has a PhD from the University of Essex and currently holds a postdoctoral position at the University of Lausanne, where he focuses on the study of public and labor economics and applied econometrics. In a moment, Dr. Rubolino will be talking to us about an intriguing program created to prevent residential tax evasion in Italy, the Italian Ghost Houses program. I first heard him present on this topic at the 2019 National Tax Association Annual Conference, and I'm excited to learn how his research and the program itself has evolved since that time. After the presentation, we'll have time for questions. So please enter any questions you might have into Zoom's Q&A function and we'll get them answered. Enrico, thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to learn about this important topic.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my research. And in this talk, I'm going to present the results of a paper on which I'm studying. My research question is whether informality detects tax progressivity. By informality, I mean where a large portion of economic transaction takes place in the informal sector, in the unregulated sector, where the government cannot observe what's going on. And tax progressivity, we mean tax progressivity as the capacity to tax the rich at an higher rate than the poor. So usually a tax system is more progressive when the rich pays an higher tax rate with respect to the poor. In order to motivate this research question, let me start by providing you a cross-country analysis. So in this graph, I'm comparing a tax progressivity index with the share of the GDP that stem from the informal sector. The figure depicts this relationship for more than 100 countries, both developed and developing countries. What you can observe in this graph is that there is a robust negative association between how much a tax system is progressive and the share of the and the size of the informal economy. So usually in countries such as Austria, Switzerland, and the US, where the informal economy accounts for a relatively lower share of the GDP, we observe a higher level of tax progressivity. So usually in these countries, the rich are taxed at a higher rate than the poor. By contrast, in developing countries such as Zimbabwe, Bolivia, and Georgia, where informality is widespread and pervasive, we observe a lower level of tax progressivity, meaning that in these countries, it's really difficult to tax the rich at a higher rate than the poor. So in general, the optimal distribution of the tax burden, so how much a tax system should be, how much progressivity a tax system should have, and what is the fair distribution of the tax burden, are kind of long-standing questions in both academic and policy circles. A key result in optimal tax theory is that the optimal marginal top tax rate, meaning the tax rate that you will face for your last dollar earned, usually this measure is negatively correlated with the tax base elasticity. The tax base elasticity measures how much the income that you report is sensitive to variation in the tax rate. So usually countries that have large tax base elasticity are countries where increasing taxes is very distortive. So for a $1, for instance, for a $1 increase in the tax burden, you will get much less than that $1 in tax revenue, because the tax system is not very efficient. There are a lot of loopholes, and so the tax base elasticity is quite large. So what you can imagine is that in contexts where informality is widespread, as in the developing world, and tax enforcement is very weak, what you can expect is that there is an overflow of tax evasion, large tax base elasticity, meaning the tax system is not very efficient, and so ceteris paribus, we should observe a lower level of tax progressivity. So the research question that I want to address is whether policies that are able to curb informality are able to increase tax progressivity. So in other words, if we have some policy that make tax enforcement stricter and they are able to fight tax evasion, in this context, will policymakers be willing to increase tax progressivity? So answering this question is quite difficult and there is not too much empirical evidence. This is mostly for two main reasons. The first one is that, as you can imagine, it's very difficult to observe and measure informality, since by definition, it's something that is not visible. The second problem is that sometimes, even if you are able to observe informality and you have some proxy for that, then it's difficult to exploit variation that it's useful to study whether it's informality that will increase tax progressivity or are other kind of things. So in a few words, it's very difficult to provide causal estimate on the effect of informality on tax progressivity. What I'm going to study in this paper is to study a specific policy that offers some nice variation and a nice setup in order to study the question of interest. So this program is called the Ghost Buildings Programs, implemented in Italy starting from 2006. It's a policy that using an innovative monitoring technique, I will show you later how this technique works. The Italian national government was able to observe and find 2 million buildings that were not registered in the land registry. So what is interesting about this policy is that we have the government, through this policy, through the Ghost Building Program, was able to fight tax evasion. Now, what I want to study is that whether this policy will also lead governments to increase tax progressivity. In order to provide empirical evidence on this, I'm going to propose an empirical strategy that basically combines cross-town variation in both the timing of program inception. So basically, the program took place at different dates across municipalities. This is something useful that we can use because we have a before and after policy that it could be used to measure the effect of the program on tax progressivity. The second source of variation is in the intensity of the program. So basically, the share of buildings, the share of ghost buildings in a town widely differ across towns. So for some towns, there were no ghost buildings, so the program was not an important event. For other municipalities, it was a big deal because almost more than 1/10 of the building were not registered. So ideally, what we can do, the intuition is that we can exploit both the before and after inception of the program and this difference intensity in the scope for fighting tax evasion across municipalities in Italy. And then I'm going to match this data with the tax rate that are set by municipality on both income and properties. I'll give you more details in the next slides. So just to give you a quick preview of the results, what I'm going to show is that this program increased structural tax progressivity. So the causal evidence that I show you today is in line with the descriptive evidence across country that I show you in the beginning of the talk. So basically, the program lead municipality to set higher tax rate on both middle incomes and top incomes and wealthy property owners, while municipality also respond to this program by reducing the tax rate for the poor. Then, as in response to this program, in response to higher tax revenue, municipality used this extra tax revenue to hire more workers and also to provide more public services. So just as a bottom line, as a policy implication of this talk, I think that what this paper can show is that enforcing tax payments has not only the power to foster tax capacity, so that it's already something that has been already shown in the literature, but it's this kind of policy had also the ability to let the government to implement more redistributive policies, such as more progressive taxes. Now, I will give you some background and data information on the cost building programs. So let me start by talking about the cost building program. So similar to other developed countries, the Italian law requires that each building, in order to construct a building, you should first obtain a building permit before starting the construction. Usually this is the classical procedure in order to be pursued before constructing a building. You need to check that the building is conform with the city plan and it's at the right distance, for instance, from a river or a sea, etc. Then once you obtain this building permit and you have constructed the building, then you should register the building in the land registry within 30 days after completion. So the main problem is that these two registers didn't communicate in each other. So basically, even if some individuals obtained the permit to build, then once the building was completed, they didn't register the building in the land registry. This means that for the government, there is no information on these buildings. And failing to register buildings is considered tax evasion. This is because buildings enter the tax base for the property tax that is just set by municipalities, but also for the income tax as imputed rent, for the waste disposal tax, and also they require the payment of registration fees. So the fact that many buildings were not reported in land registry was a problem for the government, and they couldn't raise enough tax revenue. So to give you an estimate also, it seems that the missing cadastral rents that the government estimated account for more than 800 million euros. So in order to detect unregistered building and to fight tax evasion, the Italian Internal Revenue Service carried out the cost building program. I want to give you also a quick description about how this identification process worked. So the idea was basically to first run some satellite images, satellite pictures of all Italian municipalities. Starting from these pictures, the government then overlapped these pictures with the land registry. And with some quite sophisticated technique, I will not give you the details now, but I will be happy to talk more about it later. So basically the government was able, by overlapping these two pictures, to detect portion of the lands and vegetation. That you can see that, for instance, portion of the land are those in red, while vegetation are in green. So in the step 4, the government just dropped vegetation that is not subject to taxes, and so it's not of interest, and they just keep buildings. Then from these buildings, they overlap these maps with the land registry, where you should have a complete overlapping of the buildings from satellite data with the buildings in the registry. And basically what you can observe by overlapping these two images is that there are portions of the lands from satellite data that are not covered in the land registry. And this means that we have discovered some ghost buildings. And so in the final steps, you can see the exact location of these ghost buildings, and you can run some inspections in order to define the tax base and in order to touch base with the owners and to enforce the registration of these buildings. The intensity of this phenomenon widely varied across places. So basically, for those familiar a bit with the Italian setup, basically this ghost building problem, that is a tax evasion problem, was much more common in the south of Italy, that it's the part of the country where tax evasion, civic capital is lower, tax evasion is larger, and so on. So this kind of picture is not surprising. What is surprising is that we have a lot of variation across municipalities. So for instance, in Rome, around 4,000 ghost buildings were detected that account for around 1.4 million euros in tax revenue. In other countries, mostly located in the south of Italy, this program was really a strong shock, for a strong positive shock for the local economy, because for instance, in Isola di Capo Rizzuto, that was the municipality with the largest share of ghost buildings, around 13% of the total stock of building in this municipality were not registered. So just a simple evaluation of this program suggests that in this town, the increase in tax revenue will account for, thanks to this program, will account for around 2/3 of the pre-existing revenue, that is around 1 million euros. So what you can see is that there is different scope in fighting tax evasion across places in Italy, thanks to this program. The second source of variation that will be interesting in order to really define the impact of the program on tax progressivity is the fact that the program started at different dates across municipalities. The exact date depended on the availability of digitized land registry that, as I showed you before, was a requirement in order to identify ghost buildings. We have variations. So for some municipality, the program, for the vast majority of municipality, the program started in 2007. That was the original date. In other municipalities, started a bit later in 2010 because of the fact that this municipality needed to digitize land registry. This is the second source of variation that we are going to explore. We want to observe taxes before and after the program, and also how these taxes varied according to the exposure to this ghost building program, proxied by the share of buildings that were not registered. I'm going to use data on local taxation. So before to also give you a brief introduction of the data, let me also tell you how how local taxation works in Italy. So Italian municipality basically set taxes on property and on personal income. So for property, they are the main source of funding for local governments. I think it's also similar to many other developed countries, including the US. And the tax base is defined as the net rental value of the building, net of any deductions, and is scaled by a nationwide multiplier. The tax rate can differ according to characteristics of the buildings. For main residences occupied by the owner, there is no tax rate, so they are tax exempted. A main residence is taxed just if classified as luxury properties, such as villas or castles, etc. While all the other second vacation homes, commercial buildings are taxed, and the municipality can decide a tax rate that can vary, that's usually set by 0.76%, but municipalities have the power to diverge from this basic tax rate up to 0.3 percentage points. Municipality also set taxes on personal income on top of the tax rate set by the regional government and the national government. The tax base is uniform across municipalities. This is important so that we can really just exploit variation in the tax rate with a uniform, commonly defined tax base. And the marginal tax rate, interestingly, can differ along the income distribution from 0 to 0.8%. So also in the case of income taxes, municipalities can increase progressivity by, for instance, taxing a bit more the rich with respect to the poor, thanks to this fact that the tax rate can vary across over the income distribution. Municipality can also set a tax exemption cutoff below which income is not taxed. So it's also a measure to increase progressivity, because in this way you will let the poor don't pay taxes, for instance. I'm going to use data on the ghost building programs that is provided by the Italian Internal Revenue Agency. And I'm defining the ghost building intensity as the share of buildings that contains ghost buildings in a municipality. Then I'm going to match this data with municipality level panel data over the 2001-2015 period, and on a statutory marginal tax rate set by municipalities on income and properties, on the tax base, observing different income bracket from tax return. And also, I'm going to use data on tax revenue, public spending, public sector workers from balance sheets data. I'm also going to control for several potential confounding factors at municipality level, such as population, employment, and information on local politicians. Now, I already give you some of the intuition about how I think I can exploit the change in informality. So the effect of the ghost building program on tax rates set by municipalities. But let me now discuss this in a more formal way. So we have two sources of variation. The first one is that the program took place at different time across municipality. So ideally, we have variation before and after for each municipalities. Then a second source of variation is the fact that each municipality was differently exposed to the program, depending on the share of the detected and registered building. As I showed you before, for some municipalities, the share of the detected building was 0. So the program, even if it was implemented, we don't expect to have any effect on the local economy because there was nothing changed. While for other municipalities, I showed you before, mostly those in the south of Italy, the program was much more intense because more than 1/10 of buildings were not registered. So in this municipality, we expect that the program will have a much stronger effect. So the idea is to run regression where we regress the outcome variable of interest, that it's the tax rate, but it's also other measures such as tax revenue, public spending, etc., on dummies for each year, so that we can measure the before and after implementation of the program. And then the interaction between these dummies with the share of ghost buildings, that is this measure of intensity. So the coefficient of interest is the beta coefficient here that will tell us how tax rates are evolving across municipality with different levels of ghost buildings for each year before and after the implementation of the program. So what we will expect here in this beta here is that over the years leading to the reform, this beta will be 0, suggesting that actually there are no difference in tax rate across municipalities before the implementation of the program. This will be reassuring, will tell us that, look, these municipalities are really comparable. They are not different. We are not just capturing the fact that there are municipalities in the north and municipalities in the south. They are very similar. Then what we should observe after is that for this beta k that are positive after the implementation of the program, if the tax progressivity will increase, we'll observe positive value for top marginal tax rate, for instance, negative value for bottom marginal tax rate. So municipality will respond by increasing taxes for the rich, but decreasing taxes for the poor. And we can check that. I will show you in the next graph. And then I can also account for several municipality time-varying information, municipality fixed effects that account for the fact that, for instance, municipality in the south can be persistently different from municipality from the north, and also year dummies that will account, year actually interacted with province dummies that will account for the fact that in every year there could be other shocks, other policies that are implemented by the national government or the regional government. We can account for this fact with this methodology. Okay, so let me now present you the results. The first results that I want to show you is the impact on the tax base. So before looking at the effect on taxes, let's first have a look on the change in the tax base. Why this? Because you can imagine that in response to this program, it's not clear whether actually these buildings will be registered. It's not clear whether this program really will increase the tax base in a municipality. So this is the first thing that we want to observe. We want to make sure that this program had an effect on municipalities. And this is what emerged from this picture. Here are the beta coefficients that I just introduced before. What you can observe here is that the beta coefficients are close to 0 over the year leading to the reform. So this means that the difference in the tax base between municipalities that had large share of those buildings and low share of those buildings, the difference in the tax base was not statistically significant, was 0 over the pre-reform years. This suggests that actually, once we control for all the variables I showed you before, this municipality looked very similar. What happened is that after the implementation of the program, there is an increase in the tax base in municipalities that were more exposed to the program. In general, a 1 standard deviation in ghost building density, that in other words means an increase in the share of ghost buildings by 1.7 percentage points, will raise the tax base by around 0.6%. That is around 0.7 million euros. So these are quite large effects. To give you an example, if we move from Trento, that is an Italian city where there were no ghost buildings. If we move from Trento to Crotone, where the ghost buildings account for around 10% of the total stock of buildings, it was a municipality in the south, we will observe an increase in the tax base by around 4%. It is around 24 million euros. So these are quite large effects. Now, so these figures is helpful for convincing us that this program had a significant effect on local economies. Let's now look on the effect on taxes. Here I'm depicting the overall impact of the program on the marginal tax rate on personal income set by municipalities, a different portion of the income distribution. What you can observe in this figure is that the effect on the marginal tax rate was negative for low incomes. So basically, there was a reduction in the marginal tax rate for taxpayers reporting incomes below 10,000 euros. While the impact was positive, there was a tax hike for all taxpayers above 15,000 euros, and much larger for the richest individuals. To give you also an idea about the effect, a 1 standard deviation increase in ghost buildings intensity, that remember was like increasing the share of ghost buildings by around 1.7 percentage points, will increase by around 1% the top marginal tax rate and decrease the bottom marginal tax rate by almost the same amount. So overall, this suggests that the program had a positive impact on tax progressivity. The rich will pay an higher tax rate, the poor a bottom tax rate. And here also, I want to check whether these results really reflect the effect of the program or is something else. And again, here the strategy is the same as I showed you before in the previous graph, where I'm depicting the beta coefficient. And what you can observe is that over the year leading to the reform, there are no significant difference across municipalities. All the difference emerge after the implementation of the program. And this really gives credence to the fact that it's the cost building program that affects this change in tax progressivity. The second outcome where I want to look is the property taxes. And here I'm focusing on taxes on properties that are taxed, that are basically luxury properties and second homes and commercial buildings. In both cases, what you can observe is that, again, there is a positive impact on property taxes set by municipality after the implementation of the program. Finally, also, we want to see whether this program, through the increase in the tax base by fighting tax evasion and the increase in tax rate, had any positive impact on tax revenue. And again, what I found is that there is a positive impact on tax revenue, and usually on average, a 1 standard deviation increase in gross building intensity lead to an increase by around 4% in tax revenue of municipalities. Okay, so we know now that this program, so fighting informality through stricter tax enforcement, lead to a more progressive structure of the tax schedule. So I now want to also show you some suggestive evidence on what could be the mechanisms behind this change in tax progressivity, and also what are the implications of having more enforced tax base and a more progressive tax schedule on public spending and the size of the local government. So what I did was also to look at the marginal impact of the program on tax rate in municipality with different level of with different characteristics. So I'm focusing on 4 main characteristics. The first one is to look at income inequality. So the idea is that maybe municipality can use this program, can raise progressivity also in order to fight inequalities. And this seems to be the case. Like the increase in the top marginal tax rate was larger in municipalities that started with a higher level of inequalities that is captured by the Gini index, and also in municipality where share of owners, the share of individuals that own a building was much lower. So in both these cases, it seems that municipality respond to the program by increasing tax progressivity in order to fight local inequalities. This could be a first mechanism behind the documented impact of informality on tax progressivity. Then I also want to look whether municipalities that are statistically significantly different according to the level of self-employment in a municipality. It could be a proxy also for the room for evading in other income sources, but it seems that there are not strong differences between municipalities. Finally, an additional argument could be that before the program, the tax progressivity was particularly small because of low level of intrinsic tax compliance attitudes. So, for instance, in municipalities in the south of Italy, tax compliance is relatively small. So, in this program, in these municipalities, thanks to the program, we should observe a larger increase in tax progressivity, since now you in some way are fighting the fact that intrinsic tax compliance attitudes were weak. And this is what actually I found. The program was, the increase in tax progressivity was relatively larger in municipalities that had low intrinsic tax compliance attitudes before the implementation of the program. Finally, I studied also the implication for the size of the government. So what municipality did with this extra revenue? Did they just, increase their rents, or they used to finance public service? And what I found using the same strategy is that the program increased public spending provided by municipalities. On average, a 1 standard deviation increase in cost building intensity increased public spending financed by municipalities by 1.7%. And also, thanks to the program, municipalities hired more workers. So there was an increase in demand for public sector workers, especially for part-time female workers, and in part also for part-time men workers, while full-time employment increased, but not in a statistically significant way. Okay, so I will now conclude. Let me summarize the results of this paper. So in this paper, I provide quasi-experimental evidence that curbing informality can raise statutory tax progressivity and the size of the public sector. My research design exploit cross-town variation in the scope for curbing income and property tax evasion by enforcing registration of previously unregistered taxable buildings. The main message of this paper is that policy that can enforce the payment of taxes and also they propose new technology for tax collections, have thus not only the power to foster tax capacity, but also to enhance the ability to pursue redistributive policies. So thank you very much, and I look forward for your questions.
Enrico, thank you so much for that presentation. That was really an interesting research project, and I'm very glad that the foundation had the opportunity to support it. So to those of you in attendance, if you have questions, please just put them into the chat. I actually have a question to start us out, having spent a lot of time in Italy. How was this program received by the Italian public? Was it received differently in the North and the South?
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present my work. And so for your question, it's an interesting question. So the program, yes, I think the perception was different geographically, and probably this was correlated also with some measure of tax evasion. So the program was didn't have a lot of sympathies in the South, while it was more accepted by people in the North. But there is an interesting fact. Actually, there is also another piece of evidence, another research paper that shows that actually mayors that where the share of ghost buildings was larger, in this municipality, mayors had a larger probability to be re-elected, because mayors were able to use the money to provide more public services. And so the public, the voters perceived the program as a good thing. And so in the voting booth, they were more likely to support these mayors, because they had the feeling that fighting tax evasion and then using this money in a good way probably is a good thing.
Okay, that's really interesting. And you talked about, redistributional effects, just in terms of like different economic groups and whatnot. Do you know, did the sort of country as a whole adjust the way that money is sort of redistributed? I know typically money sort of flows south, right, in Italy. And so as this revenue source was enhanced in the South, was that kind of recalibrated?
Yes, this is another interesting question. So there was some recalibration of money, because thanks to this program, municipalities in the South, that were municipalities that benefited more from the program in terms of tax revenue, can use it more or tax revenue from their home taxes, because they increased taxes, so they have also a larger tax base. And there was some spillover effect. So the government didn't have anymore the incentive to redistribute resources from the richest area in the North to the South. So the government could save also some money in this way. And in this way also you make municipality more responsible, because now they have a larger tax base, higher tax revenue, and so they can spend the money in the way that they think it's the best way, it's the more equitable and efficient way.
Interesting. Is there any sort of equivalent or related effort in, related to other tax bases beyond property tax in Italy?
Yeah, so we have this problem in a lot of tax bases. So some politicians, but also some journalists said that for Italians, evasion is like a national sport. So what we found in for properties, this underreporting in properties, we found also in the income tax base, in the corporate tax base, and also in the value-added tax base. So actually, over the recent years, the national government is putting a lot of efforts to try to fight this phenomenon. And there are other programs, like enforcement is becoming stricter and stricter also for the income tax. And let's see, we are all confident, and hopefully we will be able to fight tax evasion also in other tax bases.
Yeah, oh, that makes sense. That makes sense. So a question just about kind of the logistics of implementing a program like this. So, I I'm guessing, I don't know for sure, but then in Italy, your sort of assessment of property values is at least somewhat similar to what we do in the US, where, we have professionals who are trained in assigning a value to properties, the improvement in land value. Ideally, it reflects market value. And there's, computer assisted modeling for that and whatnot. So these properties that were newly discovered, basically, they obviously didn't have an assessed value. Was that something that was undertaken, that actual assessment, like at the municipal level? Did the federal government, did the national government step in any way? Or like, how was that actually rolled out? Because it seems like a big, especially for towns that maybe didn't have such a strong tax base to begin with, it sounds like kind of a big ask to then value all those properties.
Yes, exactly. This is another good point. So the program required a lot of efforts in order also to impute the tax base, because of course, in general, when a building is reported in land registry, you are able to observe the cadastral value, so the value of the tax base. But in this case, you don't have any information. So the procedure required a lot of efforts, mostly from people from that town, like police and other civilians, etc. So they had to touch base with the owners, or who was actually occupying the building, and proceed with some inspection in order to define the tax base. Of course, this process was quite complicated. Indeed, the program lasted a few years, because for some buildings, they were not able to touch base with the owner of who was occupying the building. They were they were not very happy, some of them, to also let these people to inspect the building and enforce the payment of taxes. So really a lot of efforts were required, but overall, it seems that the program worked quite well, because the vast majority of buildings were then actually registered with a fair tax base. But there were also a non-negligible share of these buildings that were not registered, actually, because they were unable to touch base with the owner or to define the tax base.
Oh, wow. So they were able to identify, but not necessarily value and collect taxes on everything they found.
Yes.
Wow. Yeah. Is that like a secondary effort to kind of continue to go after those folks?
Yes, because then at a certain point, it's also a matter of whether the efforts that you require, the extra effort to really try to enforce the payment of building, it's valuable or not. And it seems that in some circumstances, it was really difficult. Also because some buildings, for instance, were built in some area that they cannot be built, like very close to the river or very close to the seaside and so on. And so the law in that case established that you should demolish these buildings. And also in those cases, it's very complicated to, especially if you have families in these buildings, to ask them to evacuate the building and demolish everything.
Sure, yeah. We have a good question in the chat. Did vacant buildings come into increased use due to the tax? Which is interesting. If you're going to have to pay, do you then go ahead and get the most use out of that property that you can?
Yes. So so it's a nice question. I don't have we don't know this. It's probably a research question. We can look at this, like whether there was an increase in the number of vacant buildings since the tax rate increased. So there could be also some action in the transaction market, in the housing market. You can expect that there will be effects on property prices or on selling rates and so on. So I think this is an interesting question, and probably it's worthy to investigate.
Because I have another question, just, so this was sort of a point in time identifying, structures that they didn't know about. Is that something that's being done on like a regular basis now, or is there like basically a follow through to just ensure that more of these ghost buildings don't pop up now that they've done it once?
Yes, so that's another important point, because you don't want that this is just one point in time. It should be a persistent change in the way you are able to detect ghost buildings. It seems that the government is repurposing other time this procedure. So now that they have all the procedure, it's easy to be implemented every time, and so it should be perceived as a permanent change. So people should be aware now that this kind of phenomenon of ghost buildings is not anymore feasible, because in a while the government is going to find out this, and it's going to ask for the registration of these buildings.
Sure. Yeah. Do you know if any other countries or anywhere else has anything similar to this program?
Yes. So actually, it was quite surprising for me to discover that this phenomenon of ghost buildings, or buildings that are not reported in land registry, is quite common, both in the developing but also in the developed world. For instance, in Hungary, they started a program just a few years ago to detect unregistered buildings with a procedure that is very similar to the Italian one. It seems also that in Greece they have similar programs, they have similar problems, but I'm not aware of any program that they implemented. And it also seems that in Portugal they have this issue, and this is mostly because until a certain year it was not required to report buildings in the land registry. And so really a small portion of the land was actually reported in the land registry. A portion of buildings were actually reported in the land registry. So it's a quite widespread phenomenon. And I think the Italian program can teach us a lot about how we can fight this tax evasion program.
Yeah, no, it's such an interesting sort of real life experiment, right? And what happens when you expand the tax base really in a, fair and equitable way, and just capturing all those revenues. Okay, Rocco, I have just one more question for you. What does your future research agenda look like?
Yes, so I'm still interested in taxation and how people respond to tax policy. Now I'm investigating, for instance, a policy that implemented different tax rate, payroll taxes, social security contribution by gender. So the idea is, for instance, to tax women less in order to fight inequalities in labor market outcomes by gender. But I have also other programs on tax evasion from firms after the introduction of some taxes that mostly hit very, very big firms in Italy. So yes, it's mostly around tax policy and taxation issues.
Very cool. All right. Well, I want to thank you so much for this event and for sharing your research with us. It's just really cool stuff, and we appreciate being part of your work.
Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure for me, and I look forward for future collaboration and discussions.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks so much, Rocco. Everybody have a wonderful day.